The Stygian fortress is finally here. The Age of War Chapter 3 comes with a bunch of new stuff, some of which I've already covered, but the PvE Raid is the flagship piece of those additions. Today, we're going to be tackling it as a solo player. This content is designed for 2 players with thralls, at least balance-wise, so we may have a tough fight on our hands. We're going in with a build geared mostly towards damage and stamina regen, with Silent Legion armour for the style points, explosive jars, healing supplies, a bow is my backup, and Mushashi's Black Blade. Bear in mind the raid is not yet on the live servers, so things inside may change, and apologies in advance for any performance issues. This content is pretty hefty on the frames, which I'll touch on later. So, without further ado, let the raid begin. So that run was something. To get the most obvious point out of the way, performance is a big issue. I've got a fairly respectable PC, Ryzen 7 3700X, RTX 3060, 64GB RAM. I usually get between 70 and 90 FPS on Conan at ultra settings, sometimes higher, but performance in the Stygian fortress is pretty shocking. I was using a mix of medium and high settings at first, and if I stand in the inner courtyard and look towards the fort, I'm getting 25 FPS. Inside the fort that actually drops a tiny bit lower. Performance gets considerably better if you look away from the fortress, so the problem does seemingly lie in there. Fortunately, if I drop to low settings I can pull about 40 FPS looking at the fort, which is much more playable, but performance really needs to be looked at. In terms of the content, this is still a work in progress, but I can only really address what I experienced. For an army stronghold, there's a good challenge here, but it didn't really feel like an army, you know? There's a lot of enemies around the fort, but most of them don't seem to get involved in the battle, so I think that some sort of recall system that calls all nearby enemies to defend the fort could help with that. I know Dennis mentioned archers on the walls in the dev stream too. I didn't see any archers, so I don't think that's been implemented yet, but if it hasn't, it would definitely add to the siege feeling. That being considered, it is quite easy to get swarmed as a solo. There were a few times where I got pretty close to dying, and you can definitely end up putting yourself in a pretty bad position if you're not careful. The final boss also hit particularly hard right at the end too, which was kinda scary. There's a good amount of danger as a solo player, but for duo or trio or even larger groups it might end up being a fair bit easier in the current balance. There are a fair amount of lootable raiding items inside the raid area itself, so you don't necessarily have to bring lots of explosives with you. I found a few battering rams and a fair amount of explosive jars, so there's a bit of a safety net there, which is quite nice. Additionally, I do think the reduced health on the doors feels much better in terms of flow, as you can keep pushing forward without spending 5 or 10 minutes trying to knock out a single door. However, there does seem to be a fair amount of dead space inside the fort. There's a lot of side rooms and doors that currently don't really have anything inside them, aside from empty barrels or the occasional scroll. If you look around you can find some more of those recipe scrolls for things that I believe are from the archives, but generally there's no real reason to head off the beaten path, aside from gathering more explosive jars or battering rams. I wouldn't be surprised if this is changed, but there really should be more reason to explore the entirety of the fort and clear it out, as I feel that even though I raided it I didn't really see much of it. In terms of the loot though, not too shabby. Now to be fair, I didn't loot and explore everything, I basically looted probably about half of the enemies I killed, including the bosses. I got a few different bits of food, 10 hardened steel weapons, 1 perfected steel, a whole bunch of resources and placeables, and finally a whirlwind blade recipe, 7 commander's keys, and 11,339 gold coins. Obviously this might not reflect the final loot at launch, but in my opinion, not half bad. I didn't find it in this run, but you can also find a seemingly guaranteed spawn of Musashi's Black Blade in this room here. I have also seen some people mention how it's a bit strange that the fortress doesn't really feel Stygian. I do agree, reinforced stone does look more fortressy, but the base doesn't scream Stygia. I think that's probably because the back-end system actually uses in-game building pieces to work, and let's be frank, Stygian Pyramid is not really suitable for what they were going for here, so this is probably more of a compromise, seeing as reinforced stone is pretty neutral. Some people will dislike it, but myself I don't really have an issue with it. Overall, the raid was fun enough and pretty tough in areas, but I do think it'll be worth waiting to see how it launches on live servers. The dead zones within the fort could definitely do with some improvement, and based on what Dennis said in the dev stream, I do think they'll hopefully be improved by adding archers and more enemies, and hopefully some more interesting loot to entice exploration. The biggest issue here is, again, undoubtedly performance. On the outskirts it's really not that bad, but as you get further in and it gets more difficult, the performance degrades more. I do genuinely think that it would have been better to have some lore-friendly way to travel to an instanced area where the fort is located, similar to the Sunken City. On single player, I'm only dealing with the performance issues, but on an actual server, you'll be struggling against performance, ping, other players, and possibly the presence of other bases nearby. I love the idea of besieging enemy bases with trebuchets, explosive jars and such, and this is a really great way to approach new dungeon-esque content when it's warranted, but in this current state, the performance hit is really quite troublesome. There's probably some more optimization that can improve things on this area, but yeah, the performance is really an issue, and I do worry how it will play out on consoles. The PvE Siege has good bones, and I think that it could be a great piece of content, but the public beta period is going to be crucial for this raid to ensure it can be successful. However, despite all that, the core gameplay is really fun, so whilst improvement is needed, it's definitely worth playing for the unique raiding experience that, frankly, most of us PvE players don't really get to enjoy. Thank you for watching. Of course, a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. Let me know what you think of the PvE Raid if you've played it. I'm looking forward to seeing how it improves and fleshes out over the beta period. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.